when I first came to Penn in 2003, just maybe in the summer before I started to teach, I met in the unrenovated room at 3808 Walnut, room 111, which we were making into a sound studio. And there was no chairs in there. We sat on the floor. Al Filreis, John McDermott, who was the head of academic computing at that time, and Chris, who was a young technical support person, I guess. And Al and I talked about doing PennSound, which was something that was going out of Al Filreis' commitment here at Penn to University Without Walls and to live webcasting, such as we're doing today, and to archiving and documenting the activities that were going on at the Kelly Writers House, which is one of the great international centers for poetry, as well as the other literary arts. And we had this idea to start to archive the collections that we had of recordings of poets. And one of the things that was very startling at that time was how interested Chris and John were in supporting us. It wasn't so much even part of their jobs, but they said that they would do everything they can to make the technical infrastructure possible for PennSound. And really that has been the case. And the university here has been remarkable in its support in providing us an enormous amount of web space and technical support for doing this project. One of the things that Al and I are fundamentally committed to is creating non-commercial, non-profit, and totally accessible spaces. We feel that nonprofit educational organizations like Penn or the State University of New York at Buffalo, where I was before and started with Lost Glacier, the Electronic Poetry Center, should make as far as possible what we are doing here, the research, the syllabi, the events available to anybody with an internet connection, with no fee, no paywall. And in some ways, I always say, although PennSound is the largest archive of poetry readings in the world, perhaps even more important than the actual recordings that we have and the great pleasure in listening to them and the important work we do in preserving these works, which I can talk about a little bit in a moment, is the fact that we make everything that we have available in its entirety. You don't get 30 seconds, you don't get 5 minutes, you don't get little parts. You don't have to come to Philadelphia and get a hotel room and listen on headphones, which unfortunately is the state of most sound collections in the world. And we tried to create a model that everything that we have, we make available in MP3 files at this point with no restriction. So as a result, in addition to being an important site within poetry, within the larger internet culture, we're one of the largest archives for this kind of free cultural information. Of course, we don't compete with archive.org or the Library of Congress, although we do work with the Library of Congress. But we are setting a model, and I think when Chris and I last did this talk, we were in Paris, and there was a very contentious session at the end with the people from the French Library who were very concerned about issues of copyright and showing a great reluctance to make sound recordings available, and not so happy to follow our American model, although the French scholars who had invited us very much wanted the Bibliothèque Nationale to sort of listen to us. I don't know what's going to happen. In Germany, too, same issue. There's a lot of question of, when in doubt, make people go to special collections, which eliminates, I would say, 99.99% of the listeners that we have on PennSound would not be able to access the material in the way that is proposed by these traditional organizations. So for me, that model is fundamental to the spirit that Al and I have, and I think it continues in Al's case, since he's not here, but with us in spirit and support, with ModPo, which you should certainly, if you don't know about it, look at. And those of you who do know about it, I think about this ModPo as an outgrowth of what Al and I created with PennSound, a huge, what I don't know, it's like tens and tens of thousands of people have enrolled in this poetry class that Al does with our students and undergraduate students, graduate students, making videos, being online, and generating a great deal of interest. One of the great projects of MOOCs or these online classes that exist. And that's also part of what we're doing, and that makes great use, as do so many teachers, as well as individuals, of the PennSound archive. So, close listening. This is a book that I edited, it's coming up to be, what is that, 30 years, 20 years? 20 years ago. And it was one of the first books that tried to address the importance of the poetry reading for poetry. I just sort of leave it at that. Many people think of a poem as a kind of fixed, alphabetic written document. And of course, there are written documents related to poems and books of poetry. But in the history of poetry, that particular form is a very short part of the long history of poetry. And involves the invention of alphabetic technology about, depending on how you want to count it, 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. That alphabetic technology, which is great, and I think all of those here at Penn applaud and appreciate what alphabetic technology has made available to us. But it's not the end of language reproduction technology. And sound recording was a huge revolution about 100 years ago. And for poetry, it allows for a number of features that are not available in alphabetic technology. In particular, pitch, amplitude variation, and pace or tempo. And most importantly, accent. So if I go like this when I'm reading a poem or in this talk, there's no way to easily convey that. Or when I go slow, or when I go fast, it's not a meter, it's a performative dimension. So this fundamental material reality of poetry and poetry performance is not fully able to be heard and commented on without archives of poetry readings. People hear poetry readings, they tend to be ephemeral. So all of a sudden when we start to do this, we accumulated a huge amount of stuff and are also making the intervention, which may be more acceptable now, but certainly when I was doing these talks 20 years ago, there was a lot of resistance to the idea that a recording of a poet reading had the same status as the printed text, that somehow the printed written text was the real thing and these other things were secondary illustrations. And my point of view, to make a very long story short, is that all the different variations of a poem have equal status prima facie, or a priori, let's say, without other factors considered. Now, somebody may have a different view in different cases, but nonetheless, poets change things when they read. They say things before and after. The paratext, all of those things are significant, and there's no reason to think that when a poet reads a poem that it's less significant than the printed version that you're reading, although some poets may disagree with that on both sides. So there's a lot of resistance to that because there's so much of a commitment to print and the alphabet. I think that's eroding to some degree, but a lot of that was just a kind of a reactionary formation around performance, often put into a sort of political, anti-technological frame. And that's why I mentioned that the alphabet is also a technology. Sound reproduction is no more or less a technology, and the internet is no more or less a technology. They're neither good nor bad, but it's how you use them, which would go back to my point about making stuff available and not having paywalls, which we're able to do because I may never go beyond this slide. We're able to do it because, then I'm going to whiz through the rest of the slides. We're able to do it because of the commitment to having their work available of living poets and the estates of poets. So almost everybody we contact, from the estate of T.S. Eliot and Gertrude Stein to Orca Tierney giving a poetry reading this month in Philadelphia, are willing to allow their work to be made available for free for non-commercial purposes. They retain the copyright, a very crucial thing. We don't even do licenses. The estates and the authors retain the copyright. And of course, on the other hand, it's not only that they're willing, that they're eager for us to do it, so it's hard for us even to process the amount of material that people would like us to do. But virtually nobody that we run into, there are a couple of exceptions, but they would take too long to explain, and they're not for commercial reasons, don't want us to make their poetry recordings available. So this, again, is completely different than in the music industry, for example, or with films or commercial entertainment. And this is the beauty of poetry. These sound recordings have no commercial value. So therefore, making it available to us costs the people nothing, but we offer an enormous service, which would be very expensive, which is to archive, to digitize, archive, preserve, and distribute that work. So for almost any poet or poetry estate, it's a great value without any loss of income. So it's one of the advantages of working in a relatively non-commercial genre, such as poetry. This, of course, is Nipper. Where did I go back now? I'm missing my whole. You'll all know this famous image. I wrote an essay on this, and this comes from that essay, but I'm really interested in and this is the only thing I'll say about this, but this is what most interests me to talk about in another context, philosophically, is the condition of sound recording and the silent listener. Because normally, when you hear somebody talking outside a sound recording, you respond, it's a person present. So when you have the voice speaking, but no body present, it creates an enormous number of interesting issues, kind of comparable to writing in a certain way. So the present body of that is being presented is not there. And there is a potential, of course, for the sort of obedience suggested by the voice telling you stuff. So I'm really interested in that dynamic, but I won't talk about that so much. This, I think we told you. We have this Apollinaire recording. We could play it for you, but I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to play you the recording. But that's the earliest one we have. It's Le Pont Mirabeau. It's a beautiful recording of Apollinaire. And we are working in the sub-basement level of Fisher Bennett Hall on recovering earlier recordings, especially in the early, before there was sound recording. We're trying to get the sound waves that still exist, channel them in, and create sound recordings from the early part of the 19th century, and then we'll be moving back. All of this is my plan during my retirement, kind of seance recording, so stay tuned for that. So the PennSound Manifesto I kind of explained. I just want to mention singles because it relates to our event today, Pizza by the Slice. You are not being offered a full pizza when you're coming in. It's being cut into individual slices. When you get an album of a singer or a concert, it's broken up into singles. But poetry recordings up in this time were almost always just the entire reading, not the whole thing. So we made a big commitment to divide up these recordings, because poets typically read, 30, 40-minute sets, and they're not documented as to what was read. So in order to really make them accessible, both to listeners and to scholars, you have to determine what the poems were and break them up into individual cuts. So this very simple, obvious point gives you an idea of where we were when we were starting in 2003, and also just having simple file names is something I'm obsessed by. So that when you actually see the file detached from everything else, you know what it is. You don't have to have the web page, because you download. Everything in PennSound is downloadable. So you can download the MP3. It can float around in different ways. We want to make sure that the individual parts are identifiable. Not necessary for the pizza slice, because it's a small group eating something from an identifiable purveyor. And they're not going to float around the campus, so people will wonder, where is this from? What is this? Okay, this is just my little slide for what I discussed. This is the new statistics that we've just pulled. It's an astounding numbers. Now, if some of you are looking for, what Roy Moore's Twitter following is, does he have a Twitter feed? I'm sure. Are the people supporting him? It's not so good compared to mass culture. But for poetry, it's extraordinary to have almost 3 million downloads. And we really are very conservative about these statistics. We spent a lot of time eliminating kind of false downloads, or people are not actually downloading the files. I mean, typically a poetry book sells in editions of 50 copies to maybe 3,000. 3,000 would be a bestseller. There's very few books go beyond 3,000. So when you have 3 million, it's an extraordinary thing. And also 1 million visitors. So it's a huge number of people who are using the site. And we're very impressed. And you see the other statistics there, too. 55,000 individual files, 1,000 video files, about 6,000 hours of audio. So when you're going on that long trip to Mars, just load up the whole thing, and it'll cover you for a lot of the way. And when you get to the end of the 6,000, you'll be ready to hear it again on shuffle play. This is a kind of interesting thing, the global reach of PennSound, not surprisingly, the United States being the biggest part. But we got significant, we're really going to move into the Central Africa. They've got some access problems there in Central Africa, not the top priority, but a lot of these things I thought were kind of funny, but you're a very serious audience. But we're going to, we're very happy to see that it's used. And one of the things that Al and I have been committed to is making the work available to people who don't have high-end internet access. Originally, we had everything in Real Audio, which was a very thin system, but that's not being used so much. But even now, people, even with relatively minimal access, can download MP3s wherever they are for free. So this has been our commitment, and so we're pleased to see it distributed. I won't go in. It's interesting to see, one thing you can do with the statistics, see what people listen to. Stein, Williams, Pound, although this month, I guess, John Ashbery, who died, has sort of come to the top of our list. So, and you can see, like 30,000 for Williams and Stein, about how many, this is a yearly statistic, about how many downloads there are. So it's comparable. It's greater than certainly the number of people who would be reading their books, and probably we don't have statistics for reading these poets online. I'm going to skip that. I would show you the protocol and other things. So this is, we also do series, entire series that encompass 10 and 20 years of poetry recordings, so that you can go to that page and see all the things done in that particular place. EPC, I just wanted to mention, is the related site which has text material and digital files and author information, and we're moving to integrate those two sites as we have for a long time. That's what PennSound looks like on the back end. Just in terms of the way we organize things, we had the idea to organize it so that you can actually go in like a library stack. Again, it's not a data managed system, which is very important to us, and I'm very grateful for Chris and Chris Martin and other people who've worked on it to keep this very accessible way of finding where the files are. And anybody can go to these pages and actually see the back end of the site if they're looking for stuff, although they're also, of course, indexed on the main pages. And then inside of that, like for Ashbery, we have almost every recording that Ashbery made. All right, that's my 20 minutes, so we also do multiple versions of single poems, and I think I mentioned those issues before. I think we're going to see the introduction to Chris coming up next. There you go.
Hi. Thanks, Charles. That was great. I thought that now that Charles gave you like a kind of the broad view of PennSound with the stats and the which poets we have in the collection, I'd give you a sense of some of our current projects and things that we're working on right now and what we're thinking about for the future of PennSound. I title this playfully Accessible Poetry Interface, API, PennSound, and the Archaea Platform. And that term, the Archaea Platform, is a term I'm working with in a new essay where I'm thinking about how we can conceptualize poetry audio archives as both archival, which is the way that we generally think about them as constructions or reconstructions of our literary history, but also prospective things that ask to be built upon, like a computing API, like a computing platform, and how that can open up new questions around poetry as we study it in new ways. So I'm going to take a quick sweep at archive. I mean, you guys, this will be pretty it stands to reason PennSound Archive as archive. But one of the things that we're trying to do is to think of PennSound as a meta-archive. And what that means is that a lot of the audio files that are in PennSound came from prior attempts to do exactly what we're doing in this historical moment. They came from the early 20th century, from the late 19th century, people who had the idea to use these burgeoning technologies of sound recording equipment in order to make recordings of poets because of these very questions about the alphabetic nature of technology and the technological nature of sound. And so one of the projects I've been working on is to reconstruct what I claim, this is central to my dissertation, the first poetry audio archive in the United States, and the first attempt to do exactly what we're doing here, which dates back to 1931. It's a very interesting story behind it. The way that it started was the poet Vachel Lindsay was attempting to get his poetry recorded by Victor Records, which is actually very close to here, right across the river in Camden, New Jersey. And Victor refused to record Lindsay reading his poetry because they said, to Charles's point earlier, poetry is insufficiently commercial. We're not gonna be able to sell this stuff if we make these recordings. But for Lindsay, it was more than a question of like a vanity project. For Lindsay, he thought of his poems as being constructed of sound. He thought of the poem is not the thing that you read when you get the book. He actually called that a libretto for the poem. Like the poem was when you heard the poem, or the poem is when you went to listen to Lindsay perform, and you would make a kind of communion between poet and audience, and you would make the meaning of the poem together. So the sound recordings for him were crucial. It wasn't just like, oh, it would be fun to use the technology. And so he went to Columbia University in 1931 and met a professor of what we today would call linguistics. At the time, linguistics was in the English department. And this professor, William Cabell Greet, had a device for making dialect recordings. He was interested in the migration of dialects around the country and the morphology of dialects. And so most of the recordings in his collection sound like this.
My father came from Richmond, Virginia, and my mother from Philadelphia. I moved to New York at the age of 5 and went through the ethical culture school from the primary up through high school. Then I attended Vassar College for 2 years and am now at Barnet.
Barnet. So yeah, so that's what most of the records in this collection sound like, until Lindsay went to the lab and Greet recorded 38 records of Lindsay reading his poetry, 5 hours worth, and Lindsay was ecstatic about this. So later in the year, he wrote to his friend, the poet Sarah Teasdale, and he said, I made these records. These are my actual poems that we've captured here, and I look forward to making brand new tunes next year when I go back to the speech lab. That term, brand new tunes, being very interesting, because one thing we could infer from that is, did he intend to record poems that would never have a printed copy? Or is he trying to move into an era of sound poetry avant la lettre in a way? So unfortunately, that didn't end up working out because Lindsay died later that year. And Lindsay's death was a watershed moment for Greet, who basically it galvanized him to make his own series of recorded poetry that we call the Speech Lab recordings today, of this amazing collection of modernist poets, of James Weldon Johnson, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost. And this is the collection I've been digitizing and making available in PennSound as much for the material as it is an homage to the beginnings of PennSound. As you see, the politics and poetics of the two archives really kind of come together in a lot of ways. And these recordings, I always do this because it's fun, were recorded on these aluminum records. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this technology before. Very short-lived. In the Q&A, if you guys want to talk about the media poetics of this, we can. But most of them were melted down in the scrap metal drives of World War II, so most people will have seen one of these. And they were played with cactus needles. And so when I was doing this research to start off with, I went into the deepest corners of the internet, the darkest part of the dark web, and I found an audiophile forum of people discussing how to get the best sound out of an aluminum record. And they said, no, well, you gotta use cactus needles, but you really wanna get a good sound, you got to use the New Mexico red cactus. That'll give you the sound. So, but that's what they were played with, were these cactus needles. So we're continuing to add parts of these to PennSound. Really excited to say that we're probably going to have brand new, never before heard in its totality collection of T.S. Eliot coming out. We're working on getting the permissions for that. So much of the process is actually getting the permission to put up the works. I'm going to play you just a little bit of this one. I'm going to jump around a little bit too. their earliest known recording of the wasteland.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rains. And the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust.
That's really our goal here today, is to show you fear in a handful of dust, a handful of recordings. So that recording, if you ever get the chance to listen to later recordings of The Wasteland, very different than the ones that were recorded. And he actually recorded it again in the same year, the next year at Harvard, I believe, for the Harvard Vicarium recordings, when he had a professorship at Harvard between 1932 and 33. Oh. Yeah. Probably very likely. I couldn't say. I mean, he lived in England most of his life, but these are pretty early. I mean, I know that he was very affected in the war years when he was writing the four quartets, when he was writing especially Little Gidding. He was very affected by the war that was going on at the time, but I don't know personally.
You know, he was from St. Louis, Missouri, so I love the recreation of that stentorian voice. And the interesting thing about Chris is presenting with this early stuff, if any of you have heard a recording of Eliot reading it, April is the cruelest month. It's much more dour, it's much later in his life, and especially after the first couple of lines, it all of a sudden starts to jump around, it's much lighter. It's also true of the Frost recordings that Chris has come up with in the same series. They're much lighter. The recordings that were previously available on the Cabin Records are mostly the poets reading toward the end of their life, and they're darker, they're more formal, they're less bouncy. So that's what I'd say about this one. It's a lot bouncier version of The Wasteland.
Yeah, and if we had more time, if you hear the later sections when it does the Shakespearean rag part and everything, you really hear him start to get pretty performative in the recording. And then one of the things that we want to do is we want to start an early sound section soon. And I'm just going to gloss on this quickly, but in addition to reconstructing these earlier archives, we're interested in arts that you could think of as like apposite or overlapping with poetry. So much of vaudeville really comes up against a lot of the poetry recordings. There are recordings from important historical recordings, like from the 1893 Columbian World's Exhibition, which is the Chicago World's Fair. So we're interested in kind of telling the story of not poetry recordings as like this radical historical rupture, but kind of having threads going back into other art forms and into larger culture. So that's archive. And then just to talk quickly about platform, I think some of the most interesting research going on right now is being done by our friend and colleague, Professor Tanya Clement, who's at UT Austin right now. And Tanya is working on a project that she thinks of as distant listening, whereas you could think of that as contrasting to what we had been talking about before with close listening, where you would listen to a recording and you would use your ear to pick out things about the timbre of the recording, things like this. Distant listening is about using supercomputers to listen to the entire 6,000 hours of audio in the archive of PennSound to be able to make claims at scale that are impossible for humans to do. Did first wave modernist poets perform differently than second wave modernist poets? And if so, why? Is the tempo different? Did they use different pitch dynamics to their voice? And how are those connected to cultural questions? How could we find those in things like Churchill's speeches? How could we find those in things like sermons of the time? And what kinds of churches would have these particular sermons? So Clement also did a really interesting project around gender and applause for poets. So looking at things that we think of as like paratextual. So do female poets get the same amount of applause as male poets? Less, more, and how does it change in different historical moments? Because it turns out the machine is very good at doing things like quantifying applause. It can locate them. It can locate and laughter, things like this. So to this end, one of the things that we're working on is releasing PennSound as a data set en masse for people who want to do this kind of research to be able to download the whole collection and do this kind of work at their home institutions on their own machines. I've been working on a machine, and I'm so glad to see Ruben Weatherby here today. Ruben helped me develop an app that I want to show you guys today on what I'm terming machine-aided close listening. Machine-aided close listening is about bringing together, the text of a poem. It's a little crunched on this monitor, but hopefully you'll get the sense of it. These are at the line level. But bring together the text of a poem with visualizations of the voice of the poet reading it. So the red line here is the pitch dynamic. So you can see, I'll play some of Frost here, you can see the pitch falls as he reads it. And this number is a measure of tempo. How fast does he read this line compared to other lines? And you can see the aggregate stats up here. So 2.8 words per second is his average across the whole poem. So if we check this box here, we'll be able to see things that are particularly slow or particularly fast. So I'll just play you a little bit of this.
Something that there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast.
Frost talks a lot about how the period is very important to him in his poetry and about how it's a hard full stop for him. And you can actually see it here. You can see how much space he gives that period after he writes it. So we can start to think about the idea of scoring. How much is the printed poem a score for some performed text? I'm just going to play you the famous line because, you guys probably...
Good fences make good neighbors.
So, and you can hear very slow draws out that line. I've got an extended reading about that, which I could give you another time. But the idea here is really to try to give us the ability to talk about sound in the way that we're able to talk about the poem on the printed page. We're very good at talking about lineation, spacing, typography. These are things that we're trained in from the time that we're younger, to talk about how that extends the content of the poem or complicates the content of the poem. But we're not very good at talking about things like tempo in the poem. We're talking about pitch dynamics, talking about pacing. And so what this tries to do is to render the fugitive nature of sound legible, to basically freeze that fugitive nature, which would otherwise just pass by your ear, and let you be able to read it in some sense in the way that you would be able to read a fixed text. So then, just to wrap up, Archaea Platform, these get us to some new questions. What have we stored in the archive that we don't even know is there yet? How can we treat the archive as a platform with tools for resource extraction, and how can that shape new questions for us? And can considering accessibility, this question of open access that Charles was speaking about, at every stage of the construction of the archive, how can that create engagement from others in different outside our usual scholarly communities to engage with the archive and build on it like a platform? And we really believe that so much of what we do is about access. A lot of the projects at the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, including Jacket 2 magazine, which is our magazine of contemporary poetry, mostly criticism on the recordings in PennSound, Al's ModPo course, which I think has 30,000 students in it right now, and the Poem Talk podcast. All of these are based on providing access to these materials to people. So we hope you'll check out the archive, and we hope you'll write to us if you check it out and you see anything interesting. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Chris and Charles. That was absolutely fantastic. We actually have time for some questions. We do have a couple of roving microphones, so if you do have a question, just hold fire until you've got the microphone and then pose your question. So I'm just going to open it up to the floor. Thank you.
Yes. Right here.
Just 1 second.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your great lectures. Now I'm writing a paper about PennSound, and actually I finished it. And I want to ask a question. Where are the numbers come from just now? How many visitors and how many downloads every year? Thank you.
I want you to answer the question about where we get the stats from.
Sure. Yeah, we can send it to you. We have like a system that's dedicated to computing the stats, and they're actually pretty, the numbers that it shows are usually higher, but what we do is we try to cut out the stats that we think are not real stats, that we think are like crawlers on the web and things like this. But we can give you access to it, and you can check it out. Sure.
Yes, sir, right here in the front.
Hi. I guess my question was thinking about maybe the interdisciplinary nature of PennSound. And so Charles was talking about the performance as opposed to maybe like a textual reading of the poem. And then Chris, you were talking about kind of the way in which we're not so trained at talking about sound, and so thinking about how does the fields of like performance studies and or ethnomusicology or just like musical anthropology or music departments, how do they all like kind of come together in PennSound? How has there been interdisciplinary, I guess, like work done, or has there not been?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I could take kind of that question from the perspective of what we were talking about earlier, which is I glossed on the fact, well, I mean, a little bit more than a gloss, that the recordings were made in a speech lab meant for dialects. And it turns out that much of the early poetry recordings, they share a history with ethnology and ethnography and various attempts at kind of thinking about the cultural connotations of how people speak, which is of so much concern to the poets themselves. So I mean, I think that you can't disentangle the history of poetry from these histories of ethnography and trying to understand different peoples. What do you think, Charles?
I mean, another way to think about that question would be to think about the history of recordings of music versus the history of recordings of poetry. So, of course, as my joke about the singles has it, there's an enormous archive and analysis and response, both in ethnographic recordings as well as to popular music, of course. I mean, we were really riding on the back of the MP3 revolution in terms of the distribution of popular music. But surprisingly, very, very little about poetry. So I make the point in over and over, especially when I was first doing this, that people think that the great revolution of sound recording was for music, but few people recognize how important it is for language, and written language is equally important. And because it transforms the nature of what you might say is textuality. Because I think that what happens with a sound recording is it makes the performance into a text. So there's a textuality to the sound recording, and I think Chris's machine-aided readings are an example of that. But the minute you have retrievability of the sound, that transforms the nature of what the recording is and makes it more like a text, more like a recording. So it's a kind of, I speak of something like gramophony. It's actually, it's creating a language of the sound. But because there's not been access to this material until recently, or just really a very limited access, it hasn't really been possible to make it part of people's experience of reading the poems. I mean, actually, what Chris played very intentionally were two of the best-known recordings of poetry. And he wanted to play you stuff that you may not be familiar with, assuming that if you knew anything, you'd know The Mending Wall and The Wasteland, because they were produced in records. In any way, my generation grew up with these LPs that we played, along with maybe Dylan Thomas. But the fact is that there's even of those poets, there's an enormous other materials that are available to open up that archive and to make them part of the classroom. I wouldn't emphasize so much, but nowadays, people teaching modern and contemporary poetry will have the sound files listened to by students first coming to read it. And I know in China, this is a person that spoke as a visiting scholar from China. There, it's crucial because you can read a poem and really lose. In China, students are starting to learn English. They're excellent students, but they never hear anybody talk. And they're not used to understanding. When I went to China for the first time, speaking to many of these people, I know probably only about 30% of you can understand what I'm saying because I talk too fast and with such a strong accent. But there in China, it was even less. Very few people could actually understand when I talk this way. So you don't get the rhythm and the texture. And I would say that for anybody, understanding the words is not as important as understanding the sounds and the rhythms. You can only understand what it means, just as I would say with music. You hear it, you don't necessarily know what the singer is singing. Later, you may figure it out. So to actually have poetry available equally as a sound recording is crucial to having people not only where they're speaking English, if it's English language recordings, but also people who are studying American poetry because it allows a much more direct and fluid understanding of the rhythms, the sounds, the accents, and also the differences of accent, which again links back to what Chris is saying in his research. It's so interesting that one of the main treasure troves of American poetry was done in a speech lab recording that was interested in accents, because one of the most powerful aspects of American poetry is the different accents and tempos that American poets have, which is almost entirely obliterated. You could say T.S. Eliot tried to obliterate it by moving over and moving to England and creating this kind of transatlantic sound. But William Carlos Williams, if you hear his recordings, and we have about 20, 25 hours, I mean, he lived very close to here. The late recording that was always available to all of us was after he had a stroke. They're beautiful recordings, but they're not like any of the rest of them. And then you hear a local person, you know, I mean, he's as local to New Jersey as Bruce Springsteen is. And I think that it's very hard for people to hear that sound of the locality, which was his poetics. He said it over and over again. So it really opens up poetry to certainly in the path of ethnomusicology and the early people who recorded the blues and folk music, people like Alan Lomax, you know, and Harry Smith's compilations. Those are heroes for all of us involved with PennSound. We're all deeply indebted to those recordings. Person in the front.
I know with...
No, they want the recording because it is being recorded.
Oh, no,
and okay, good, yeah.
I know with books on tape, often they dissuade the author from reading their own work. They say an actor can do a quote-unquote better job. Can you name any poets that you think aren't really doing their work justification, or they're just sort of throwing away the lines, and is that part of the persona too? That adds to it, that they're not milking the musicality out of the words like a performance.
When you ask me, I mean, I much prefer the William Shatner versions of the Bob Dylan Mr. Tambourine Man to the original. I don't think, Nobel Prize or not, that Dylan is able to give the full feeling that William Shatner does. I'm sort of notorious for, in my early writing, saying that almost as an axiom that I'm interested in the poets doing the recordings. It's not like criticism of that. Am I fetishizing the poet? But I would just say yes. I'm not troubled by that. That's not an accusation to me. But you know, to be like letters, there are reasons to want to hear the poet reading it in terms of its connection to understanding the rhythms and the sounds. There's also the fact of the history of the archive. In the history of the archive, almost all of the recordings that we have are of the poets reading their own work. There's very, very little stuff except for, you know, a very specific theatrical group of things. But the vast bulk of poetry readings that have recordings, or the vast bulk of poetry readings that are done today, in let's say Philadelphia 2017, are done by the poets. So to speak about actors doing it would be to impose something that doesn't really exist. But by and large, in my judgment and experience, actors, because of their training, are unable to read poems. And their sense of how to put the work across and so on is often incompatible with the way in which the poems work. It's because actors often want to have a personality and an emotional affect that they're projecting, the character. And poems, in the way that I'm interested in having them read, have to do with the text itself, the words on the page, and letting them have their own rhythms and so on. So it's a very different kind of performance. I also am notorious for liking readings which most people consider to be very dull and monotonous, because that's an interesting style that people adopt. But of course, there's certainly terrible readers, but I often think that it's not completely true, but very often when a reading is really terrible and you don't like it at all, it's probably because you don't like the poem. I can think of some exceptions to it, but by and large, my experience, those things come together. John Ashbery reads in a monotone, but it becomes, if you love his work and you start to hear what he's saying and listen, it opens up into a whole world. It is also true the books on tape is like the elephant. We're a tiny thing compared to listening to books on tape. And that's an interesting, well, Paul Auster, our most popular person, is not primarily a poet. He did a incredible, it's like a 24-hour recording of his recent, recording himself, 4-3-2-1, which is really great. And it's great to hear him read it, and also just the scale of him recording that. But by and large, those are done by actors, but those are novels. They're more like plays. They have characters. So I don't know if Chris has a comment on this.
No, I think it's a great question, and we had talked about the Eliot before, where like his own readings of his own poems are different at different points in his life. Like I think if you hear him reading The Wasteland, like in the like I think it's like the late 1940s or early 1950s recordings, like I think it's not a good performance compared to the earlier ones, which kind of gets to the question of like one of the things like Charles and I are interested in is in not fetishizing even a single performance of a poem, but to say that the poem exists in this like constellation of all of the performances and all of even the written variants of it, and you have to read across all of those to locate the poem in some sense. So I think it's a great question.
The most common recordings that we have on PennSound of people reading other people's poems are memorials, where other poets read the poems, and that's interesting and often great. But those are poets doing those interpretations and readings in the specific kind of elegiac context. So that's another sort of subgenre that exists of non-authorial readings.
All right, this will be our last question of the day here. So here you go.
As you're starting to be able to quantify a lot of these things, like such as pitch and tempo, is there any movement to kind of have some sort of standard metadata for sound attributes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's probably our biggest lack right now in PennSound is having the kind of metadata to answer those kinds of questions, like what Clement is working on and some of the machine-aided close listening things. And so as we work on bringing out PennSound as a data set, that's exactly something that we want to do, which is to release the metadata alongside the data set. So you could query along gender lines or on other kind of questions that you would want to know about.
I think of what Chris is doing, and now I told that story, so I'll end with it. When we first met him here at Penn in 2003, and the first thing that Al and I wanted to do was, you could say, down and dirty. There was a huge amount of recordings that were on cassette tapes and reel-to-reel that were basically disintegrating. People had them, and with Ashbury, it's a good example. They were like behind the staircase in his country house, and David Carmani, his husband, would hand me shopping bags. I meet him at a coffee shop near their house, and he'd give me shopping bags of the stuff. And and I'm mentioning Ashbury not because it's more or less important, but arguably one of the most prominent living American poets at that time. We thought the vital task was to make MP3s or not even WAV files, which again puts us into an interesting conflict with archivists who reject this approach. But we were interested in archiving as a mode of distribution. And this is something that the NEH, for example, I think disgracefully has opposed. They prefer privatizing these collections and not distributing them as a matter of policy. But we feel distribution is a method of archiving and preserving. So we needed to preserve all this stuff. So we did it quickly and as best we could. A huge amount of stuff that you saw. PennSound 2.0 is represented by Chris becoming associate director of the site and moving ahead with the kind of wonderful collaboration with you, which I'm so grateful for. And I think that's definitely, now that we have the material, we need to focus on the kind of issues that you've just raised. And I think we will in the next phase.
Sadly, that's time for us to conclude today's program. Thank you again, Charles and Chris, for your fantastic talk. Thank you all for coming to Penn Arts and Sciences Knowledge by the Slice. If you're keen to see a replay of today's lecture or any other talk from our library of lectures, then please do visit us at Penn Arts and Sciences website on the Penn Arts and Sciences Video Library. Thank you all